when you look at the principles of Catholic social teaching, you have to understand that they're rooted deeply in the faith of the Catholic Church and the faith of the Christian community, and actually in the whole Judeo-Christian tradition. You go back to Jesus being asked, what's the greatest commandment? And answering, it's love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your strength, your passion, and love your neighbor as yourself. And so it's the two great commandments. And so if one cares about individuals, the second great commandment, who are hungry or who are suffering from war or who are persecuted, then one has to get involved in the structures and systems of society in order to express that love that Jesus talks about in the gospel. In Pope Benedict's writing, he says, for example, and I think it's the first time I'd ever seen anyone say what were the great parables of Jesus. In Benedict writing in his first encyclical, or his third, says that the three great parables of Jesus are the Good Samaritan, the story of the rich man and Lazarus, and the judgment scene in Matthew 25. Now, they are all about social justice. And Benedict says they are the three great parables of Jesus. So, I mean, the whole teaching of the Church is rooted back in the Gospels. And then farther back, it's rooted in the Old Testament in terms of the responsibility that the community had to care for a group of people called the Anawim, A-N-A-W-I-M, which meant literally the little ones, or second meaning was those who cry out to God for help. And they were widows and orphans and strangers. A group we translate as strangers, sometimes sojourners, but basically they were foreigners, foreign workers. And I've said for years to people, if you think about who's poor in this country and in the rest of the world, it is generally poor women, poor children, and people who are different from the majority, namely, first, immigrants and refugees, then people who are racially different from the majority, then people who have a disability, et cetera, who are treated as if they're, quote, not like us. They are the poor in almost every society in the world. And it tracks from who were the Anawim, who were God's beloved poor. When the U.S. bishops write about it, when they write about the Old Testament tradition, they talk about the Anawim were God's beloved poor, and that language is used by Pope John Paul II as well in his writing, that they are God's beloved poor. And so the whole prophetic tradition in the Old Testament was about, the short phrase people talk about it was about denouncing injustice, namely how are the poor treated, and announcing justice, namely how should society be structured and how should we treat people around us. So that's really how Catholic social teaching connects to the body of our faith. It's intrinsic to the body of our faith. The Old Testament talks a lot about the people of God with God in their midst and their responsibility to one another. Jesus will talk about the reign of God as being how we should live with one another if we live in the love of God at large. And Catholic social teaching really is trying to address what that means now in this world, in our modern space and time. So basic themes from the Old Testament, like the responsibility to the little ones, to the Anawim, to the poor, the teaching of Jesus about, especially like Matthew 25, when did we see you, Lord? When I was hungry and you fed me, when I was naked and you clothed me, when I was in prison, etc. All aspects of what it means to promote the reign of God, etc., among humanity. God, we talk about often the kingdom of justice and love and peace as being what Jesus was preaching. It's probably what the prophets were calling for in the Old Testament as well, and it's what Catholic social teaching is trying to spell out in terms of a lot of specifics in a very complicated universe, and universe that has so many social systems and structures within it. What's new, I think, in modern Catholic social teaching, especially in the second half of the 20th century, is the understanding of the important role of systems and structures in how one builds the reign of God. And that systems and structures can keep us from living in love and justice with one another. For example, if our economic system is such that some are rewarded extraordinarily and others don't have enough to meet basic needs, then you don't have us working towards the reign of God. You have a system that's blocking that then you have to change. That's the denouncing injustice theme from the Old Testament. You have to speak out against what is unjust, and you have to announce how society should live together. And so those are all roots within the scriptures themselves. One other biblical theme that I think is important in understanding Catholic social teaching and in understanding the reign of God is the theme of the Jubilee. It's a much unappreciated theme. The tradition was, and this is from the book of Leviticus, so this is very early Jewish thinking about how they were to live together, was that in every 7th year was to be a, quote, lesser Jubilee. Let me go to the big Jubilee first. That in every 49th and or 50th year, we're really not sure, and maybe it's a combination of both years, there was to be the great Jubilee. That anyone who had lost their property, lost their flocks, become indebted, become enslaved, which was often for debt, was to be freed. They were to be restored back to full membership in the community and given a share in the community's goods and land. In every 7th year was to be a lesser Jubilee, which is called, actually, it's the Sabbath year. It's actually also the sabbatical year. So college professors probably don't understand that tradition of the sabbatical actually goes back to the book of Leviticus. And it was a year in which, again, a kind of lesser Jubilee was to take place. People would be restored back to right order within the community. Slaves would be freed. Debts were to be canceled. We don't know how well the Hebrew people lived up to these. We do know that the rabbinical writing is filled with commentary on what your duties were in the sabbatical year or the Sabbath year and in the Jubilee year. So we know they grappled with what this meant to live that way, which is part of their understanding of how they were to be a chosen people with God dwelling in their midst, which is the image, sort of the Old Testament image for what does it mean to be the people of God in the Christian era. And so the Jubilee is very important. I think it's important in the current debate over immigration, because part of it was about restoring people back to full membership in the community. I use it in discussing immigration this way. We now have people in our communities who live in the shadows, but they grow our crops or harvest our crops. Their kids go to our schools, they're in our churches, they're in our supermarkets, etc. And they are, in a sense, like slaves in the Old Testament, or they're basically the Anawim, they're the strangers. And basically what the Jubilee says to us is, it's time to restore these people to membership within the full human community and to bring them back into the community. It's a reconciliation concept. If you want to use a Catholic concept of the sacrament of reconciliation, it says, let us be reconciled to one another, to be joined back together with one another. And so it has deep scriptural roots, which have very concrete contemporary applications in a lot of areas, in criminal justice, in immigration, etc.